Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, listen closely, because the words I am about to speak are not whispered for politeness or diplomacy. They are shouted from the very soul of a continent that has endured centuries of exploitation, oppression, and manipulation. Africa, my Africa, is awake. And today, I bring a message not just to the powerful corridors of global finance, but to every man and woman who has been told repeatedly that their future is not theirs to shape. For decades, the International Monetary Fund, the so-called guardian of economic stability, has cast its long shadow across our lands. It arrives not as a partner but as a patron, a shadowy architect of policies that strangle the potential of nations before they have a chance to stand on their own. Loans tied to conditions that demand austerity, structural reforms that strip resources from communities, and advice that prioritizes foreign profits over human dignity. These have been the hallmarks of their influence. And for too long, Africa has acquiesced. Too long, we have bent under the weight of imposed frameworks, masquerading as guidance, but in truth designed to tether our growth to the whims of distant capitals. But hear this clearly, that era is over. I speak to you today not just as a witness, but as a participant in this awakening. I speak as someone who has walked the dusty roads of West Africa, where farmers labor under a sun that has baked the earth for generations, yet cannot feed their own children because markets are manipulated from thousands of miles away. I have seen the bustling cities of the continent, kinetic, vibrant, full of life, where innovation blooms despite constraints, and yet capital flees to foreign shores, taking the fruits of African ingenuity with it. I have stood in the shadows of our mining towns, where minerals of incalculable value are extracted with precision and care, only to enrich corporations that know nothing of our history, our culture, or our humanity. And I have listened, oh how I have listened. I have listened to the elders who speak of kingdoms that existed long before colonizers arrived, empires that traded across continents, cultures rich in knowledge and tradition. They remind us, quietly but insistently, that we were never backward, that our systems were not primitive, that our potential has always been vast, only interrupted by external forces that sought to define our worth in terms of profit margins and debt ledgers. And now, their wisdom echoes louder than the rhetoric of multilateral institutions. We are reminded of who we were, who we are, and who we can be. The IMF has been warned before, though perhaps not with sufficient clarity. It has been whispered in corridors of power, murmured in the halls of conferences, questioned in reports penned in cautious tones. But warnings diluted in bureaucracy do not shake the foundations of empire. No, Africa speaks differently today. Africa speaks in the voice of assertion, of refusal, of unflinching resolve. And it begins with the simple but profound truth: we are not your colony. Yes, I said it. Not your colony, not your experiment, not your passive recipient of policy prescriptions. For too long, the narrative has been shaped by those who neither live in our realities nor understand our dreams. But the winds are changing. Across the continent, voices rise in unison, from the northern deserts to the southern tip of Cape Agulhas, from the bustling markets of Lagos to the sun-baked streets of Bamako. The cry is the same. Our future is ours to define. Let me be precise. The IMF and institutions of its kind operate under the guise of neutrality and expertise, but neutrality is a myth when power is imbalanced. Expertise is hollow when it ignores the lived experience of the people it claims to serve. Austerity measures that slash education, health, and infrastructure are not abstract policies. They are the slow erosion of opportunity, the quiet culling of possibility. And we, the people of Africa, will no longer accept that erosion as inevitable. Consider for a moment the cost of compliance. Every nation that bows too readily to imposed economic strategies pays a price that is not immediately visible on balance sheets. Communities fractured, public services hollowed out, talent fleeing for greener pastures abroad, a generation told that ambition must bow to foreign prescription rather than indigenous strategy. These are the real costs, costs that compound like interest, invisible to those who measure success only by GDP growth or foreign investment figures. And yet the narrative persists. Africa is fragile. Africa is dependent. Africa is a puzzle to be solved by foreign minds. We reject this narrative. We are neither fragile nor dependent, and our solutions do not require permission. The continent teems with intellect, ingenuity, and resilience. From the tech hubs of Nairobi to the solar farms of the Sahel, Africa innovates despite, not because of, external dictates. Our universities, our entrepreneurs, our artists, our scientists, they are the living proof that dependency is a choice imposed upon us, not a natural state. So what does it mean to say, Africa will no longer be your colony? It means a refusal to accept policy prescriptions that prioritize debt repayment over human development. It means asserting our sovereignty in economic planning and global negotiation. It means building alliances that respect mutual benefit rather than extracting advantage. It means that our resources, natural, intellectual, cultural, will be leveraged first for the benefit of our own people. Some will call this defiance. Some will label it dangerous. But let us be clear, courage is often mistaken for recklessness by those unwilling to share power. What we are doing is neither reckless nor naive. It is deliberate. It is strategic. It is a declaration that the centuries of imposed dependency have ended and the era of African agency has begun. I have met policymakers, economists, and financiers who still believe that debt and conditionality are tools of stability. I have debated in halls where every argument for austerity is presented as rational, objective, necessary. But I tell them now, rationality without justice is tyranny. Objectivity without humanity is coldness masquerading as wisdom. Stability that comes at the cost of eroding the future of millions is not stability, it is subjugation. Africa will chart its own course. We will invest in our youth, our education systems, our infrastructure, our healthcare, our agriculture, our industries. We will redefine success not as the accumulation of wealth by foreign institutions, but as the thriving of our communities. And we will do so not in isolation, but as equal partners on the world stage, commanding respect, not supplication. Today, I stand before you not merely to warn, but to declare, not merely to critique, but to inspire, not merely to recount history, but to demand the creation of history yet to come. Africa will no longer be your colony. The IMF, the World Bank, and all who have profited from our constraints, hear this. Your time of unchallenged authority over African destiny is over. And we will remind you, every day, in every decision, in every step forward, that Africa's future belongs to Africa itself. Because we remember, because we endure, because we create, and because, finally, we refuse to be silent any longer. Pauses, letting the words sink, eyes scanning the unseen assembly, voice softening but firm. This is not merely rhetoric. It is the beginning of a movement that will reshape not only our economies but our identities, our relationships, and our destiny. The path will not be easy. The forces of inertia, of vested interests, of historical habits will resist, but we will persist. We must persist. For the chains of financial colonialism are no match for the determination of a people united in vision and purpose. And so, the warning is clear, simple, and unyielding. Africa will no longer be your colony. To understand why Africa must declare its independence from the suffocating grip of global financial institutions, one must first look unflinchingly at the mechanisms of control, the chains that have bound our nations for decades under the guise of assistance. These chains are not forged of iron or steel. They are written in legal documents, embedded in policy frameworks, and reinforced by a language so technical, so bureaucratic, that it lulls the unwary into compliance. They are loans disguised as lifelines, debts presented as necessary sacrifices, and reforms packaged as rational solutions for efficiency and stability. Consider the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 1990s, when the IMF and World Bank dictated the economic agendas of countries across Africa. Governments, desperate to maintain solvency, were instructed to cut spending on social programs, privatize essential services, and liberalize markets at breakneck speed. On paper, these measures promised growth, modernization, and integration into the global economy. In reality, they hollowed out societies. Healthcare clinics closed. Schools became inaccessible to the poorest children. Food systems, once locally managed, were exposed to the whims of global markets, making famine not just a natural disaster but an economic inevitability. It is easy to write such policies in reports, easier still to justify them in boardrooms thousands of miles away, far removed from the dusty villages, the bustling urban neighborhoods, the women and men who toil endlessly to feed, educate, and sustain their families. But in every village, in every city, the consequences were painfully real. People suffered. Dreams were deferred. Futures were mortgaged to satisfy foreign creditors. And yet, many of these programs persisted, decade after decade, because the architecture of power was designed to perpetuate compliance. Debt rescheduling became a tool, not a relief. Conditionalities became a subtle method of governance. Countries were lauded for discipline when they implemented policies that eroded their own sovereignty. Africa's resources, its wealth, its labor, its innovation, were monetized, measured, and extracted not for the benefit of its people, but to stabilize currencies, appease investors, and maintain the illusion that the global financial system was equitable. But history, as relentless as it is patient, has a way of unveiling truths that cannot be ignored. And now Africa sees clearly. We see that what was sold to us as expertise was often self-interest. What was presented as neutrality was often manipulation. What was defined as support was often control. And most importantly, we see that compliance was never the only option. Resistance, strategy, and sovereignty have always been within our grasp. They were simply discouraged, belittled, or made inconvenient. Let us turn to examples, not for the sake of rhetoric, but to demonstrate that alternatives exist, and that the IMF's influence is not inevitable. Take Ghana, for instance. Once lauded as a model for structural adjustment, it endured years of austerity that left many citizens without basic services. But in recent decades, Ghana has begun to chart a path that balances fiscal responsibility with social investment. By strategically managing debt, attracting sustainable investment, and strengthening its domestic industries, Ghana demonstrates that African nations can engage with global finance on their own terms, not as subservients, but as equal partners. Or look at Rwanda. After a devastating genocide, Rwanda could have relied entirely on foreign prescriptions for recovery. Instead, the country pursued a model that prioritized national priorities, rebuilding infrastructure, promoting education, fostering entrepreneurship, and leveraging technology for public service delivery. External assistance was welcomed, but not dictated. Loans were evaluated not by their immediate financial terms alone, but by their alignment with a broader national vision. The result? A remarkable turnaround that underscores a truth too often ignored. Africa can thrive when African leaders, and by extension, African people, define the rules of engagement. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, across the continent, similar stories unfold. Innovation springs not from external handouts but from indigenous problem-solving. Markets are created, industries are born, and social progress is achieved when local context informs decisions, rather than distant economic dogma. The pattern is clear. When Africa takes ownership of its destiny, growth is not only possible, it is sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. And yet the IMF persists. Why? Because it functions not purely as an institution of aid but as a mechanism of influence. Loans are extended with strings attached, interest rates are structured to maintain dependency, and conditionalities are crafted to prioritize the repayment of foreign creditors over the needs of local populations. Nations are nudged toward liberalization policies that benefit global capital more than domestic prosperity. Agricultural subsidies in Europe or the United States continue to undermine African farmers, while African governments are pressured to open markets that leave local producers vulnerable. It is an invisible architecture of control, perpetuated not by overt conquest but by financial leverage, technical language, and political pressure. But leverage is only as strong as compliance allows, and compliance is weakening. Citizens, activists, economists, and leaders are speaking out, not just in protest but in strategy. Regional alliances are forming. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one such example, a vision of intra-African trade that reduces dependency on external markets, strengthens local industries, and creates a platform for negotiating with the wider world from a position of unity and strength. Currency unions, sovereign wealth funds, and alternative development banks are emerging to provide African nations with options beyond traditional IMF frameworks. These are not mere experiments. They are the foundations of a continent reclaiming its economic sovereignty. And let us not forget the moral dimension. Beyond the financial implications, there is a justice that must be acknowledged. Africa has been a net contributor to global wealth for centuries through resources, labor, and intellectual contributions that have fueled the growth of distant economies. Yet the benefits have rarely accrued equitably. Debt, extraction, and conditionality have too often perpetuated a cycle where Africa pays to grow the wealth of others while its own potential remains constrained. To reject the IMF's historical models is not rejection of cooperation. It is a demand for fairness. It is the assertion that Africa's people are entitled to the fruits of their own labor, the dividends of their own innovation, and the dignity of determining their own path. Some will say this is ambitious. Some will call it reckless. But ambition without sovereignty is meaningless, and caution without justice is complicity. Africa has the knowledge, the talent, and the resilience to forge a new economic paradigm, one that serves the people, protects the environment, and positions the continent as a global leader rather than a perpetual debtor. This is not utopian dreaming. It is a practical roadmap informed by evidence, ingenuity, and the hard-won lessons of history. To the IMF, the World Bank, and all institutions that have profited from Africa's compliance, understand this. The continent will no longer accept policies imposed from afar. The continent will no longer tolerate measures that prioritize balance sheets over human lives. The continent will no longer allow its natural wealth to be monetized for external gain without corresponding benefit at home. Africa's voice is rising, and it will not be silenced by technical reports, by bureaucratic jargon, or by the thinly veiled authority of financial power. Africa demands equity. Africa demands agency. Africa demands respect. And most importantly, Africa demands action. Action that reflects the aspirations of its people rather than the priorities of foreign creditors. The chains of dependency may have been long, but they are brittle when confronted with a united continent determined to reclaim its future. The path ahead will not be simple. Resistance always faces opposition. Old habits, entrenched interests, and the inertia of decades of subjugation will not vanish overnight. But persistence is in our nature. Innovation is in our blood. And sovereignty, true, unapologetic, self-determined sovereignty, is our birthright. So let this chapter be written clearly. The warnings of Part 1 are now substantiated by evidence, by example, and by the resolve of nations ready to act. The IMF is no longer the uncontested architect of African economic destiny. The world will witness the rise of a continent that defines its own policies, protects its own people, and invests in its own future. This is the new Africa, not passive, not dependent, not constrained, but vibrant, assertive, and unyielding in its pursuit of freedom. And as we turn toward that future, as we begin to implement strategies, forge alliances, and reclaim what is rightfully ours, the message remains unaltered. Africa will no longer be your colony. Not in words alone, not in dreams alone, but in action, in policy, in the very structure of its economy and society. Because a warning alone cannot free a continent. A diagnosis alone cannot heal it. Africa must chart a course, a path towards sovereignty, dignity, and sustainable prosperity that no external institution can dictate. And this path exists. It has always existed, hidden in plain sight, overlooked only by those who have underestimated the strength, creativity, and resilience of our people. The first principle of this path is unity. Africa's strength lies not in isolated efforts, fragmented policies, or competition for scraps of external aid. It lies in collaboration, across borders, languages, and histories. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is the embodiment of this principle. By creating a single market encompassing more than 1 billion people, the continent can leverage its collective power to negotiate on equal terms with global partners. Trade policies, investment treaties, and economic alliances can no longer be dictated from afar. They can be determined collectively, with African interests as the guiding principle. But unity is not abstract. It requires deliberate action. Harmonization of regulations, cross-border infrastructure, coordinated industrial policies, all these are essential. Imagine a continent where goods move freely from Lagos to Nairobi without bureaucratic bottlenecks, where electricity grids and railways connect nations rather than isolate them, where innovation hubs across different countries collaborate instead of competing destructively. This is not a dream. It is an achievable goal, provided political will, vision, and accountability align. Second, Africa must reclaim its financial sovereignty. Dependence on external loans, dictated interest rates, and imposed conditions has been a tool of subjugation for decades. Alternative financial mechanisms must emerge. Sovereign wealth funds, regional development banks, and intra-African investment vehicles. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Botswana have begun laying the groundwork for funds that invest in domestic priorities, energy, agriculture, education, without foreign strings attached. Similarly, the African Export-Import Bank provides a blueprint for how regional institutions can rival global ones while remaining accountable to the continent's needs. Debt restructuring is not a concession. It is a negotiation from strength. African nations collectively have the leverage to demand fair terms, transparent processes, and financing that promotes development rather than perpetuates dependency. The age of blind compliance to externally imposed debt policies is ending. Africa's leaders must wield this leverage boldly, strategically, and unapologetically. Third, human capital must be prioritized. Any strategy that ignores education, health, and skills development is a strategy doomed to fail. The IMF often emphasizes fiscal restraint, frequently at the expense of investment in people. Africa, by contrast, must invest aggressively in its youth. Schools, universities, technical institutes, and vocational training must be funded as priorities, not optional expenditures. Healthcare must be robust, accessible, and preventative, not reactive. For without a healthy, educated population, there can be no innovation, no entrepreneurship, no meaningful sovereignty. Consider the youth as architects of the new Africa. Technology hubs from Cape Town to Accra are not anomalies. They are signals. They are proof that African innovation thrives when supported rather than constrained. African leaders must foster these ecosystems, ensuring that talented individuals do not flee abroad because opportunities are scarce at home. By creating local innovation economies, Africa can reduce reliance on foreign technology, retain intellectual capital, and compete globally on its own terms. Fourth, natural resources must serve local development first. For centuries, Africa's mineral wealth, oil, timber, and agricultural potential have been extracted primarily for external benefit. Foreign corporations profit massively, while local communities see little improvement in infrastructure, education, or quality of life. Strategic partnerships can be formed, but ownership, value addition, and benefit sharing must be non-negotiable. Local processing of raw materials, equitable taxation policies, and reinvestment of profits into domestic projects can transform resources from tools of dependency into engines of prosperity. Fifth, Africa must embrace strategic diplomacy. The world is not monolithic. Not all external actors are adversaries, but diplomacy must be conducted from a position of strength, clarity, and self-interest. African nations must collectively negotiate trade agreements, technology transfers, and investment deals, ensuring they align with national priorities. Conditionality that erodes sovereignty must be rejected outright. Alliances with non-traditional partners, emerging economies, regional blocs, or multinational African enterprises can provide leverage against institutions that historically sought to control, not empower. Resistance is not only diplomatic or economic, it is also cultural and intellectual. Africa must assert the validity of its knowledge systems, its histories, and its innovations. The global narrative has long marginalized African achievements, framing progress as something imported rather than created at home. Education systems, media, and cultural institutions must be strengthened to celebrate African solutions, African thought, and African leadership. Only by reclaiming the narrative can Africa truly reclaim its autonomy. But let us not romanticize the path. Challenges are immense. Entrenched interests within and outside the continent will resist change. Bureaucracies, corruption, and inertia can slow progress. External pressures from creditor nations, multinational corporations, and global financial institutions will intensify as Africa asserts its independence. Yet history demonstrates that persistent, strategic action can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, the economic resilience of nations like Botswana and Mauritius, and the recent rise of African technology and industrial hubs are all proof that deliberate, coordinated action works. The role of leadership cannot be overstated. Africa's leaders must be courageous, visionary, and accountable. They must reject short-term expediency in favor of long-term national and continental prosperity. They must engage their populations, ensuring transparency, participation, and shared responsibility. Without leadership grounded in vision and integrity, the strategies I have outlined will falter, and the people, the heart of this continent, must rise in tandem. Citizens, civil society organizations, entrepreneurs, and academics must hold leaders accountable. They must participate in policymaking, challenge decisions that undermine sovereignty, and support initiatives that prioritize African interests. True independence is never gifted. It is earned through collective action, vigilance, and commitment. Africa's path to sovereignty is not about isolation. It is about equitable engagement, partnering with the world, but on Africa's terms. It is about leveraging global connections while preserving autonomy. It is about ensuring that the wealth, knowledge, and potential of the continent are harnessed first and foremost for African development. The IMF, World Bank, and other global institutions may continue to resist this shift. They may attempt to assert influence through loans, conditionality, or political pressure, but their leverage is weakening. The rise of African-led development banks, continental trade agreements, and sovereign wealth funds signifies that Africa is building alternatives. These are not empty gestures. They are tangible infrastructures of power that enable independence. Let me be clear, the road ahead is long and the struggle will be arduous, but it is no longer optional. The consequences of inaction are stark: continued exploitation, stunted growth, and generations constrained by externally imposed frameworks. The consequences of action, however, are profound. A continent that thrives economically, innovates relentlessly, and asserts its rightful place on the world stage. So to those who doubt Africa's resolve, let the examples already underway serve as evidence. To those who underestimate our capacity, let the ingenuity of our youth and the richness of our resources serve as a reminder. To those who cling to old systems of control, let the rising tide of African sovereignty serve as a warning. The continent is awake, organized, and unyielding. And as we move toward this future, let the principles guide us. Unity, financial independence, investment in human capital, equitable resource management, strategic diplomacy, and cultural affirmation. These are not abstract ideals, they are actionable strategies. They are the tools by which Africa will reclaim what is rightfully its own: sovereignty, dignity, and the freedom to determine its destiny. Africa will no longer be your colony, not in words, not in compromise, not under the shadow of debt or conditionality. Africa will be Africa, free, sovereign, and unstoppable. Pauses, voice softens but carries weight, as if the continent itself is listening and responding. And with that, the roadmap is laid bare. The warning has been given. The chains have been examined. The strategies are visible. Now comes the work, the deliberate, persistent, unyielding labor of turning vision into reality. And when that work is done, when African nations stand independently, robustly, and assertively, the world will witness a transformation unparalleled in history. Because Africa does not ask for permission. Africa does not wait for approval. Africa acts, and Africa succeeds. We have come a long way in this journey. From the warnings of imposed control to the vivid examples of resilience to the strategies for reclaiming our destiny, one truth stands unshakable. Africa will no longer be anyone's colony. The age of external dictates, of debt-driven dependency, of policies written far from our realities, is over. What rises now is a continent united, determined, and unapologetically sovereign. This is not merely a statement of defiance. It is a blueprint for action. It is a call to governments, to leaders, to citizens, and to the youth who will inherit this land. Embrace unity. Invest in your people. Guard your resources. Engage the world from a position of strength, never subservience. And remember, sovereignty is not a gift. It is earned through strategy, perseverance, and courage. The IMF, the global financiers, and all who have sought to define Africa's path must understand that their era of unquestioned authority is ending. We are moving forward, together, boldly and with vision. Every trade agreement we sign, every policy we implement, every industry we build is a step toward a future that belongs to us alone. And in that future, Africa will thrive, not as a subject, not as a debtor, but as a leader on the global stage. This is a movement, a moment, a turning point. The world will watch as we transform vision into reality. And to those who wish to follow our journey, who wish to witness and support the rise of African sovereignty, stay connected, stay informed, and stay engaged. Africa's story is being written now, and it is one of triumph, resilience, and unyielding pride. Subscribe, follow, and join us, not merely as observers but as participants in the creation of a new Africa. The dawn has come. The future is ours, and together we will ensure that Africa stands free, strong, and unstoppable.